So in the next 40 minutes, I want to tell you a little bit about an emerging business model that I've been working on for the last 3 years together with literally like hundreds of other people around the world. But before I go there, I want to start by sort of setting up a bit of a context for this work, which really goes back to the last 40 years. Right? So when we look at the last 40 years, we've seen a steady increase of the productivity of the American worker, which really rose by 73%, while hourly pay stagnated over the same time. So it's around an increase of 11% over the same time, which adjusted for inflation really amounts to stagnation. Right? And as you are well aware, of course, there's also a steep increase in income inequality. So 62 individuals own the same wealth as 3.5 billion people in last year. So I'm sure you are aware of these kind of statistics. So you have an increase in productivity, a stagnation in wages, and the project of political democracy has really propagated in the last decades in many countries, while workplace democracy has really been left behind. Right? So there's a real tension between the two. You could also argue that the web has really hit rock bottom, at least when you look at the original intentions of the founders of the internet and also Tim Berners-Lee, who hadn't really intended for this kind of concentration that we are seeing today. Right? And at the same time, also, you have, over these last 40 years, this emergence of a real nationalism, as we see it play out right now very clearly, right? In isolationism, nationalism, and also isolationism, right? In the United States, through the last election, we saw also cultural schisms really playing out significantly. But this is not only happening here, also France, Germany, the Netherlands, so all over Europe as well. So again, over this time period as well, we had, over these last 42 years, a shift away from direct employment. So fewer and fewer people are protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act. So by 2020, the projection goes that 40% of Americans will be freelance. And so today already you have 55 million Americans being freelancers. So that is 1 in 3 Americans being a freelancer already now. Which, I'm not exactly bemoaning employment per se, right? I mean, okay, not everybody works for Google, but people in other sets of employment will not be as enthusiastic about employment. But there's one thing that I would insist is really a big loss, which is the rights, right? The worker rights that came under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, unemployment benefits, the 8-hour workday, workers' comp, all of which are gone in this new setting, in this freelance economy. Right? And I think there's a broad recognition that this really is not sustainable. Right? Now sort of switching to the on-demand economy, sharing economy, collaborative economy, whatever you want to call it, depending if you're European or American. And so that you could place the beginning of that maybe around 2005, right, with Amazon Mechanical Turk, 2008, the financial crisis, on the heels of which people were much more likely to take low-paying jobs. And on the other hand, right, we saw, and I think there's, I'm sure, a broad agreement in the people in the room here, that there's a real significant consumer convenience that comes with this sharing economy, the likes of Uber and Airbnb, right? So there's a real consumer convenience that is, appreciated. There is access to work, I mean gigs, right? Not employment, but gigs, that has increased for people who are in between jobs and students, for example, right? So I would very much recommend my students to work in that economy, because with TaskRabbit or other companies, the amounts of money you make are not are probably more than they would make otherwise. Right? So there are opportunities also for the upper middle class. So if you own a 5-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side, it's like a really fantastic opportunity to rent that out when you spend your weekends in the Hamptons, right? So you can make thousands of dollars with that. Of course, a bit different if you live in a project or, or African American, as this Harvard study showed, right? A clear difference between an African American man trying to rent out and a white woman. So there are all these sort of racial aspects coming into this economy as well. So, and then this is not necessarily, I mean, people always say like, well, I was just at a conference and somebody says like, well, Uber and the whole sharing economy, how much of the GDP is that? That doesn't really matter to anyone. It's like so small, right? But what happens is with many statistics, especially government statistics, they really don't catch those people working in that economy because they only look at employment, or they look only at the large amount of income that people generate. Only that is counted as a job, and the rest falls to the side and is not recorded. So, but if you do look at people working on platforms, and you do account also for smaller amounts of income, then like this Pew survey here, you will learn that 24% of Americans, in fact, worked on platforms in 2016. So it's not a niche. So I worked about this for the last 10 years, and worked on digital labor for a long time on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the book that you're seeing here is sort of a mapping of the digital labor landscape and its many opportunities and problems, ending with the proposal of what I call platform cooperativism. And I congratulate Rachel that she was able to pronounce that. And then there's a second book, which we don't have here, which is Ours to Hack and to Own, which is really a collection of some 40 authors responding to this idea of platform cooperativism. And I will explain what that is in a minute. We also learned today that Travis Kalanick stepped back as CEO of Uber. And this came on the heels of the Delete Uber campaign, if you remember this, right? Like when they joined the economic board of the Trump administration, 200,000 people deleted their accounts, which shocked them enough to withdraw from this economic board. And then, of course, the very, very influential and consequential blog post by Susan Fowler, the former Uber engineer, who revealed the misogynistic work culture at Uber. And then, there are other movements and incidents which would be demonstrated by this hashtag Airbnb while black and others. There were also demonstrations of hundreds, thousands of drivers in India, Uber and Ola drivers. So there's a clear pushback against this economy, right, which you can see. So I would suggest, and I'm not alone with that opinion, that we are really looking at a market failure, and based on the sharing economy, and that is based on the intrusions, privacy intrusions that we saw with the likes of these taxi companies that we discussed, but also with the concentration of data, which is really weakening competition, right? And you see also technology companies allowing the exploitation of workers, right? So that is also well documented and by now quite uncontroversial, and attacks on public infrastructure and many other reasons that we can discuss as well. And there's always this discussion in Silicon Valley of framing all of this as innovation, right? And I think what we really need is to really think about whose problems are actually solved by this innovation, right? Are these the problems of middle-class people? Or are these real problems of people in need? But are these the most burning problems that this innovation solves, or whose problems are addressed? So here you can see the Barcelona City Council in the background in this photo that really looks at social value creation and insists that basically citizens and the needs of citizens are addressed through technological developments that are implemented in Barcelona. So then there's the obfuscation of language. So you have this wonderful mobilization of the language of love, of sharing, all these like wonderful sort of 70s discourses that are mobilized to sell commercial platforms. And so, you know, like Eva Illouz, the Israeli sociologist, talks about like the language of intimacy even being brought into this discourse, right? So that you feel when you listen to the discourses of Airbnb or even Uber, it sounds almost as if you talk to a lover, right, at night on the pillow. So it's this kind of the counterculture, obviously, that is mobilized, right? The language of counterculture. So they really try to sell themselves at the top of this image. You can see the sort of counter-revolution, counter-cultural forces where, in fact, you know, they're really not. So the California ideology. You, at the same time, another sort of, still sort of trying to frame this sort of 40-year-long development, right? You also have a technological displacement of labor. So with the development really where you can already foresee that a tiny group of owners will be in charge of and will be the owners of artificial intelligence, right? And so how will this escalate all of these developments? So there is a lot of talk about, you know, certainly in Europe and now also increasingly in the United States about universal basic income, right? And the post-work society, Paul Mason wrote a book about post-capitalism. And, you know, it's wonderful. I would love to live in a society where my life opportunities are delinked from wages. That would be super awesome. But this is also, certainly in this country, a very long time away, right? It's very far off. And I think what many of these activist groups, like Occupy Wall Street, in fact, were lacking, where they presented critiques and perhaps even a long-term vision, but what they didn't offer were near-term alternatives, right? So things that you can do when you leave this room and you can do next Thursday, right? So direct projects to engage with. So my proposal is basically with this platform cooperativism is to work towards a diversified digital economy in which you don't have only 4 or 5 players, but also many small businesses. And one that is not looking only for solutions in technology, right? So not having these sort of, you know, to solve everything, click here philosophy or ideology, but to really look broadly also at the communities and what they really need, right? Locally. So platform cooperativism is not about it's not a silver bullet. It's not the solutions to everything. But you can see it clearly in tandem with other movements like the B Corps movement, credit unions, the pro-commons movement, the creative commons, solidarity economy, community currencies, and many other projects. So it's really not a multiculturalism, right? So it's not about unicorns, but really about zebras because they, in fact, exist. So it's also, you know, this moment, like looking at this historical moment, there's a great opportunity recognized by many people that comes with the retirement of the baby boomers, which means that a lot of businesses are changing hands, right? So many of them are bought by Goldman Sachs already, but others are not, right? And so here's an opportunity to basically rethink worker ownership and to think about what it would be like and also give workers this awareness that they could, in fact, be owning the businesses they are running, also in the digital economy. I don't know if you're familiar with these guys here, the Rochdale Equitable Pioneer Society. So this was the first consumer cooperative in Rochdale in England. Interestingly, geographically, and also in terms of the time, quite close to the foundation of unions as well, who came out of guilds in the same region around the same time, right? So you had the first cooperatives emerging really as a response to precarity, right? So they were starving. So they said, well, let's buy oatmeal and milk and butter together, right? And it will become cheaper. And this became a very successful model. So And this is something, so if I would talk with you individually, I'm sure, if we would go to the cafeteria, I'm sure like most of you would tell me, well, but cooperatives, come on, we've seen this before, clearly not working, right? It's an old-fashioned model, and I've heard this like very many times. But in fact, just like this frog, right, it's hiding in plain sight. Right? Cooperatives are really hiding in plain sight. So from the Barcelona Football Club to Ace Hardware, REI, Associated Press, these are all cooperatives that are enormously financially viable. And like you can see here, 1 in 3 Americans, in fact, is a co-op member. I mean, I'm certainly in many co-ops. And how many of you are co-op members of some kind? Aha, so some of you, fantastic. $500 billion in total annual revenue, nearly 1 million jobs, 5 billion in wages. So it's definitely not a failing model. I mean, this is something that's clear. It's not taking over the entire economy, clearly, but it's also not going away, and it's also not a failing model. I mean, I think this is quite clear. If you look at this, Mondragon, the largest worker cooperative in the world in Spain, has 74,000 members and is a major economic force in that country. So what I'm proposing, and I have sort of worked my way up to this, so now we are sort of there, is what I call, and this is hard to pronounce, you can try this 3 times fast, platform cooperativism. So the idea to bring the cooperative business model to the digital economy. In short, like what would it be like if the drivers would own something like Uber? What if residents would own something like Airbnb? As it turns out, I wrote a text about that in 2014, which kind of became viral. And then I suddenly realized, like, oh my God, what I was writing about actually exists. So there are many companies like that out there. So we created a large conference in 2015, like with very many people attended that. And out of it really became an international movement around this model. So it's based on co-ownership of the platforms, so cooperative ownership of the platforms and the data, and democratic governance. So in the co-op tradition, 1 worker, 1 vote, right? This is how decisions are made about what happens on the platform. So advantages of this, and immediately somebody would say, like, well, how does this compare to Google? Or how does this compare to the unicorn model? And well, here you have, there are, of course, many disadvantages, but also many advantages. So advantages include that they have a larger resilience. So there's research that shows that cooperatives have a lower failure rate after 5 years, 80% versus 41% of co-ops will then still be around. It keeps money in the community. You have access to member capital when you're starting, right, as a startup. There's ownership and control of the people who are involved in the cooperative. This could be multi-stakeholder, so in the sense of users of a platform owning the platform as well, or really just the people who are making a living through that platform. There are tax benefits. There's a potential of a cooperative data commons, and I will talk about this with an example afterwards. And just sort of to give you an idea, many of these platform co-ops take 5% to operate the platform compared to 25 to 50 with the unicorn model, right, with the investor-owned model. So a clear difference. Also, productivity benefits are demonstrated with cooperatives. So the transition, happens in various ways. We see this, so basically cooperatives turning into platform co-ops, unions joining co-ops to form platform co-ops. There are startups that are transforming. There are failed startups that are turning over, like a Deliveroo type project in Belgium, for example, turned into a cooperative, was just taken over by the couriers when the startup failed. And then, of course, we see mounting antitrust efforts against many companies. And the hope is that when this happens, basically one of the split companies could become a cooperative. So there are opportunities to reinvent themselves, but opportunities for reinventions for co-ops, for the worker ownership model, for free software developers, and also for unions. So the question also becomes, how can people make a decent living? So everybody committed to the commons, right? How can they also make a living? So there's a long tradition and a strong movement behind, Wikipedia and of course open source, etc. What has often been forgotten is basically that people also need to be able to make a living. And there are examples of, for example, free software cooperatives, but there are very few. So often the assumption is that these are sort of well-situated middle-class individuals who contribute to the commons, have the time to do so, and the resources. And the question becomes now, how can you find business models that contribute to the commons, but also provide people with a living? OK, so in which sectors is this playing out? It's all over the landscape, right? So it's vastly distributed. It's not just one area. It's everything from childcare to software development. There are cooperative online marketplaces, as you will see in a second, health data cooperatives, translation, credit unions, crowdfunding, journalism. I will give you a few examples. So on our site, platform.coop, you can see this sort of world directory where you can click in and you can actually see the individual co-ops and where they are located. And yeah, so I mean, afterwards we can go into more examples. This sort of like, it's a patchwork of all these different companies that are in existence right now. I just want to sort of highlight a few, 3 or 4. Stuxy, for example. So it's a really fascinating and really wonderful company. Started by the founders of iPhoto, who basically were then bought out by Getty Images and started their own stock photography site in Canada. Based on the idea basically of pushing back against the sort of very cliched stock photography, right? The man in the white suits, or the white man in the suits in these sort of boardrooms, that's really not what work looks like for most people anymore, right? So they wanted to create a different kind of stock photography, but they also wanted to make sure that the photographers that are contributing to the site can make a living, right? So it's not about the race to the bottom, but it's actually about commitment to a smaller group of photographers. So they made $10.7 million last year, $300,000 in dividends, and supported 960 photographers, or 960 photographers contributed to this cooperative in 63 countries. And they served 124 of the Fortune 500 companies. And so it's a great product, but at the same time, it's operated in a way that is very different to investor-owned companies in that they really invest in the workers, if you like, in the photographers, because they say, here are our 960 photographers that we commit to, and so we need to make sure that they deliver the product that makes us successful. So that gives them the drive to actually educate them. So they have these online meetings, continuing education, if you like, for the online labor market, where they show them what kind of product they are looking for so that they can improve and deliver more photography that they can accept, right? So this is one example. Here they are. Now, about a month ago, in May, their Up and Go was founded here in New York, which is basically a platform for home cleaning, so you should all use it, which basically connects people to cooperatives in their neighborhood, right? So you order a cleaning service through this platform and will always be connected to a co-op in your neighborhood. And the difference is that they basically charge 5%, so 95% of the profits go to these low-income immigrant women. And they're interesting, I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but they're interesting design differences as well, where, for example, there are no individual worker profiles. And there's also no reputation system. So what you will find on the site when you type in your zip code, all you get is a photo of the cooperative, and somebody from this co-op will service you, but you do not know who. And this was a long discussion with those workers, for example, and we can talk about that. It's an interesting difference. So this is what it looks like, very simple interface. And here is one of the cooperatives that services the site. So if you want to do something for low-income immigrants, use this site. This is then what you get in the interface when you decide whom to work with. Okay, another, and I'm going to go fairly fast through a few more. Loconomics is a labor market for freelancers in San Francisco. So anybody from psychotherapists to massage therapists, tutors, and so on, go through the site to find clients. It's a labor brokerage and run as a cooperative, right? And interestingly, again, like different to the venture capital model, their bylaws protect exit, right? So pivot is impossible, right? So nobody could buy them out. They will always be co-op owned. So Green Taxi in Denver. So has 800 members, Denver, Colorado, from 37 countries. Each of them contributed $2,000 to, basically launch the upstart. And they were helped by the communication local 7777 to basically deal with local regulation to sway that in favor of the cooperative, right? Just like Uber has to buy their regulation. Also, of course, cooperatives have to do similar things. They captured 1/3 of the Denver market, right? So this is this model pronounced My Data in Switzerland, coming out of the ETH in Zurich, that basically looks at the fact that there are so many health data that we have today, from 23andMe to Fitbits, and nobody really has them in central control, right? So there is no central ownership of those data, partially for regulatory reasons. The government doesn't allow Google, for example, to do that, right? There are many laws against that. But with cooperatives, it could be different, where you basically say that there are national data co-ops for patients that can then decide to release these data to their general practitioner, to researchers, or even sell them to the industry, and the profits would never go to the individuals, but go into public research or civic-minded projects. This is how the project is set up. It's already profitable in Switzerland. It's now also starting in Spain and in Germany. So this is the current model, right? So corporate central ownership. And their model is basically a federated cooperative model, where, because the laws about health data are so different from country to country, you could basically release your data across borders through the sort of federated cooperative data commons. There is more conceptual work underway with Airbnb, where basically groups in, actually now there are 2 groups with the same title, confusingly enough, Airbnb in Canada and Airbnb in Amsterdam. And the Canadian model is really about changing regulation in terms of Airbnb. The Dutch model is really about building a platform that will be resident-owned under cooperative ownership, that allows residents to say, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but cities like Barcelona and Amsterdam are flooded with tourists, which creates very serious problems, really way too many tourists, right? So your local grocery suddenly turns into a Nutella store, which locals don't really want, right? Or in Barcelona, nothing against Nutella, right? Or in Barcelona, you have like a vegetable market that is flooded with tourists who don't really buy vegetables, and the locals don't want to go there anymore because it's, they can't really shop there because there are so many tourists. So like issues like that, and partly caused by Airbnb. And so basically the idea in part is also to put a limit on how many people can be in the city at one time. And that would be controlled by citizens or in collaboration with the city. And so it's an interesting project. Then I don't know, some of you may have heard about that we tried to, my colleague Nathan Schneider and the campaign associated with that tried to come up with the $12 billion that it would take to buy Twitter, which is up for sale, and turn it into a cooperative. And it was, first I thought that, well, this will never go anywhere. Hundreds of articles around the world written about this, and the shareholders voted on it, and with 4% of shareholders in favor of discussing it, it will be discussed again at the next board meeting next year, right? So democratic ownership of the internet also being part of this discussion. So there are, journalism platforms like Positive News in the UK that are cooperatively run. In the United States, you may be familiar with Banyan News, which really tries to think about like how to push back against fake news through cooperative ownership. And Resonate, which just launched after a very long time, basically in Berlin, which is a cooperatively owned music streaming site service trying to create competition for Spotify. And if you look at the numbers, it's quite interesting. So basically, it pays musicians 200% more on 100,000 plays than Spotify. It basically uses blockchain to put make a living for musicians again. And it's a stream-to-own model. So the more often you are streaming a song, the more you own it. So you basically link it to your credit card. And with every play, it deducts a few cents. And until you own the song in total. And the platform itself is owned, as you can see at the bottom here, by artists, so the musicians themselves, the listeners, so a multi-stakeholder model, and also the employees of the company, right? So it's a mixed model like this. There are sanctuary platforms that create, like in Germany with its 1.5 million refugees, many of them are actually IT professionals, and now they are in some refugee camp. I don't want to call it camp, but they can't work. So because they can't leave. So, but if they would be able to, a platform like that, be able to connect to Germans who are looking for IT work, this would create basically a market like that. Lastly, Famondo, an online labor market that overtly tries to compete with eBay and Amazon. So it's focused on fair products, or fairness in all regards, really. Like, so fair labor, selling the fair phone, and other fairly produced products, etc. So they're really into transparency, as you can see here. And so, yeah, of course, so I should end this talk by saying that there are, of course, also quite enormous challenges, which have, of course, to do with funding, right? Unsurprisingly. And then issues like, the value proposition. So with something like Stocksy, you could see that they really they came out of the corporate sector, and they really understand what it means to create a good product that functions in the market. Other companies are really so excited about starting a cooperative that they are not so focused on the value proposition and then have problems with that. There's a question of education. I mean, I don't know if any of you went to business school here. Anybody got an MBA? I mean, they're not even taught about the co-op model, right? Certainly in universities, you're not taught about it anymore either. And so people just really don't know, right? And yet, like I said, hidden in plain sight, they are really all around us, right? 1 in 3 Americans being part of one. So it's definitely a model that's all pervasive and yet sort of overlooked. And there's this problem of data centralization. Of course, the network effect, I don't have to tell you that, plays out in favor of the existing platforms, scaling issues, etc. But so the question then comes basically, how can you create institutions that support this new economy, right? And so we started with platform.coop, which is basically a hub where people who want to start co-ops like that from all over the world can have a starting point. We are working and hope to perhaps interest you as well to work with us on designing an open source labor platform that could be used around the globe, because what happens right now is that people basically from San Francisco to New York to Argentina to India are all starting the same project, right? They're all designing these labor platforms, and of course they could all, there's a huge waste of effort and money, resources. So there could be an open source kernel, right, that could be then plugged in with the help of local programmers to adapt it to their local needs. We have an overview you can see on the website where you can sort of follow up on that and get involved if you like. We set up a consortium which basically brought together institutions that are in support. So, like from the Berkman Center to MIT and to Oxford Institute for Internet and Society, and then many cooperatives and businesses as well, and as well as unions who are basically all working to support this. And you can join us on November 10 to 11 at the New School here in New York, just a few blocks from here, when we have our next big gathering. We hope to get Bernie Sanders to come, and the People's Disruption Platform Co-ops for Global Challenges. And this is where I will leave it. Thank you very much.
Hi. Any ideas on how big companies like Google could turn into a co-op, number one, if you thought about the challenges of something like that? And number two, in a co-op world, how do you prevent the capitalist, the VC basically, from eating the co-ops, not because they're going to acquire them, but because they're going to starve them by doing aggressive price cutting and those kind of things?
Right, right. Well, I mean, there is increasing turn of antitrust measures against Google, right? People writing books about it and policymakers getting more interested in the idea. So if you think about if this will ever happen is the other question, but if there is such breakup, like I said in my talk, right, the idea would be that one of these smaller companies could be run as a cooperative or could be mandated to be run as a cooperative. And to answer your second question, they don't take VC money. So the money comes from users. So for example, Fairmondo put a cap on 20,000 euros per investor. And they are users of the site, so they are members of the co-op. So they get their capital from members, not from VC. So there is no controlling influence.
Now, let me clarify the second question. What I meant is, how do you prevent a company like Uber to compete with the green taxi of Denver? Because Uber could say, hey, free rides for everybody for the next 5 years because it's powered by VC capital, and then green taxi dies and Uber lives. How do you prevent that?
Yeah, right. Well, you can prevent that, but you can look at markets and industries in which this model could be more successful than in others. For example, in the United States, as much as in Europe, home health care is a huge issue where this model could really succeed very well. But you see it also in Denver. There are cities like Austin, right? In Austin, there are platform co-ops and also a DAO, if you're following that discussion, basically that work in markets where Uber is not so dominant, or left, in fact. For example, Italy, right? So Italy, the Italian government just sent us informed us that they are basically financing a study to see if platform co-ops could be rolled out all over Italy. And because Uber announced that they will leave the country. So, I guess like one answer to that would be in niches where they are not competing or in niches where they don't operate. It's, of course, yeah, I would think the idea here is not to destroy Uber, right? I hope I made that clear. But it's more to sort of, the objective is a more diversified digital economy and one where alternatives, ethical alternatives like that, have some room in the market, right? I think it would be unrealistic to think that they would dominate those markets.
Does anyone here use Juno? I use Juno.
I mean, Juno was interesting because it had a worker ownership model. I don't know if you followed this, right? So they basically said if drivers have high performance, they will own part of the company. Only problem is that they then were purchased by Get, right, and betrayed the workers. And this is not really happening anymore. So we deleted them from our website. But there are dozens of companies that do operate, right? So like Cortabo in Italy, ATX. I mean, there are many examples. Austin Rights. Yeah.
The thing that stuck out to me about this, because I think it's easy to argue that over time, overall, it's cheaper for everyone, but there's a minimum buy-in for people who want to be part of these co-ops. And I'm wondering how that affects something you talked about earlier, which is whose problems are getting solved by these things. You mentioned UpGo. I don't know if that's an example.
Well, so there are lots of different ways of funding these. So like Up and Go was funded through foundation and a bank, right? So Barclays Bank and the Robin Hood Foundation here in New York, that's a foundation that aims at alleviating poverty in New York City, invested in that. And then there are, blockchain schemes where people basically try to find new funding ways. We are just about to create a platform co-op crypto token to basically allow people in the ecosystem, in the crypto system, crypto token system, to invest in this model as well.
Wouldn't that lead to situations like Juno, though, if you're getting external funding but you want people to be owning the company?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about kind of where a co-op might not be the best thing, where a kind of a larger company where I mean, when I think about Uber, the thing that's nice about it is I can go almost anywhere and use it, whereas these co-ops, you seem to be kind of focused in smaller areas rather than kind of a large extended co-op.
Well, it depends, right? So I agree with you. So the most sensible areas would be where I think where research and development is not very extensive. So probably not in automated cars, right? Probably not in self-driving cars. So like where, I mean, development of AI, I would not place on small cooperatives, right? But even in that discussion, it would be interesting to see, and there are already cooperatives that actually contribute to the research of AI companies. They are not doing it themselves, but they are part of this picture. They're trying to insert themselves in that. That was your first question, but then you had a second one.
No, that was kind of my...
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And this is why areas, for example, like, home health care, like I say it again, we saw it being very successful in the Netherlands, where basically groups of nurses form cooperatives, create websites with services like prenatal care for Latino women. This is, for example, done here in Southern California, where, these nurses traditionally through temp agencies would pay 50% to the temp agency. And now they have a very different situation when they run their own operations like that, right? So there are clear advantages for particular groups, I think. So, yeah.
One other different question. You kind of mentioned that there would be this ideal co-op platform kernel, and we make platforms here a little bit sometimes.
I've heard about that.
What kind of main features do you think would exist in this type of platform?
Absolutely. Well, it's really 4 apps, right? So it's it's one worker-facing, one client-facing for iOS and for Android, right? So it's really like 4 apps that one would have to develop, and then they would have to plug into different applications locally. Right, so it would just be the kernel, and then local. We wrote like what you would consider a small grant, what I would consider an enormous grant for this, and we tried to make a dent in that, and actually hope to have this done in the next 2 years. Yeah. So if any of you are interested in this, I think that they would like to support this, we would of course highly welcome that.
I had a question about policy changes that could encourage more co-ops or level the playing field or take a holistic approach to creating a world that results in more co-ops or whatever that would be. If
Absolutely.
people are thinking about
Yeah.
that, or if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, no, so we, part of what this organization, the PCC, the Platform Cooperativism Consortium, does is we write policy briefs, right, for senators. And and, you know, I don't know, in October we talked to the G7 about this. And yeah, no, we wrote one for Christy Gillibrand, who requested one, because Christy Gillibrand and Bernie Sanders created this package on May 11th, I think they released that, where they proposed a large push for cooperatives. And so I think the interventions are mostly on the municipal level, right? Wouldn't have all too much hope on the federal level, and at least for the next 4 years. And but I think you can work with cities very much so, and hoping to bring about local legislation that is in favor of that. And there's a whole sort of list. I mean, in fact, even a slide I can show it to you afterwards, which lists the things that we are proposing. You know, like a revolving loan fund for platform co-ops, town halls, right? Set up town halls to discuss these issues, and many other things. The problem with in American policy is that it's relatively friendly to monopolies, but it's really hostile to cartels. And something like Mondragon, which is really a network of cooperatives, would definitely be seen as a cartel and would not be tolerated. So you have to find ways to influence that, right? As the people in Denver did. Thank you, everybody.